my name is Tiffany Bai, and this is my presentation over Claude Monet for my research video assignment for art appreciation. So in Paris, France, on the 18th of November, 1840, Oscar Claude Monet was born, though he's known better just as Claude Monet. You can see a photograph of him on the left-hand side and a self-portrait of him on the right-hand side. As a self-portrait would suggest, Claude Monet was primarily a painter, and specifically he was fond of oil paints, if you can tell by his self-portrait. He was an oil painter active during the Impressionist period, which is a style characterized by visible brushstrokes and on plein air painting that captured the quote-unquote fleeting feeling of nature. On plein air painting was a method of painting where one painted outdoors rather than inside of a studio, like most of the artists did during this time period. As many of the Impressionists do, Monet often repeated the setting of the painting to capture it in different lightings. For instance, his Water Lily series has over 250 different iterations of just that one location over the water with the bridge hanging over it. We'll come across an example of it in just a second. Monet died on the 5th of December, 1926 in Giverny, France at the age of 86. He lived a long life. So here are three different Impressionists that were, of course, also active when Monet was active. First here is Edward Manet, A, not O, who I will refer to from here on out as Edward, just to avoid confusion, since Monet and Monet and Manet sound sort of similar. See, I even confused myself there for a second. But anyhow, Edward was, of course, also an Impressionist. He liked painting portraits more than landscapes. Monet was very fond of painting landscapes, and Edward preferred to paint portraits more. He also had a more realistic style than Monet did. The next of the Impressionists is Pierre-Auguste Renoir, which I'm sure I am butchering his name, sorry. Anyhow, he was a close friend of Monet's, and he also liked to paint portraits more, just like Edward did. Similar to Monet, he had very visible brushstrokes that were very typical of the average Impressionist of this time. The next of the Impressionists is Alfred Sisley. A modern criticism I've heard recently in a blog post was that he has a very restrained use of his colors compared to Monet. Both of them liked landscapes, and both of them liked to do on plein air painting, which I would imagine sort of goes hand in hand with liking to paint landscapes. So here are three different artworks that Monet had. As you can see, the first one here is the Water Lily Pond. This comes from that series I mentioned earlier, of course, the Water Lily series. This is an oil on canvas painting, of course, as Monet was an oil painter. This painting is 34.8 inches by 36.7 inches, and it is featured in the National Gallery in London. The next painting is Impression Sunrise, another oil on canvas. It's 18.9 inches by 24.8 inches, and it is featured in the Musée Marmottan Monet in Paris. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. The next is Woman with a Parasol, and it is oil on canvas, of course. It is 39.4 inches by 31.9 inches, and it is featured in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. So I wanted to focus on Woman with a Parasol, which was made in 1875. It's a painting that captures a casual outing of a woman out with her son. It does lean more towards realism. It is a bit stylized, but I would say that overall it is a realistic painting, a more or less realistic painting, just a bit stylized with the heavy brushstrokes. I would also say that it is a portrait of a woman, although there is indeed a background. I'd say that it does focus on the woman with a parasol, and it does have very vibrant colors and contrasting values. You can see like the really saturated blues and greens, and of course the dark in the grass compared to the light of the grass. And it also has a very cool color scheme, what with the blue of the sky and the green in the grass. There's blue reflected from the sky in her dress, and there's even purples that you can see in her dress and in the grass for shading. Overall, it has a very cool sense of color in it. As for principles of art, you may see movement in the clouds. I personally did. I thought there was a bit of movement in my eyes with the clouds and also the drapery of her fabric, and I also thought that there was a bit of scale going on between the son and the mother. The son is obviously very much so a child. You can see, just looking at the roundness of his face, you can see it, but also in the scale, he is much smaller than, any adult would be, of course, compared to the mother, even taking into account the perspective of him being farther back than the mother is. So I personally found interest in the sky, actually. I think that Monet definitely has a talent for painting landscapes. I'm sure because he painted so many of them, of course. I really happen to like the sky in this one. Um, I believe that Monet probably was painting this for the purpose of light, of course. As an impressionist, he was, of course, very fixated on light, and his Water Lily series is definitely like proof of just how much he focused on lighting and wanted to examine light. And I would imagine that this one is no different. He probably wanted to see, capture different lighting in this. This one does have very impressive lighting going on here. Um, I would say that this painting gives me like a very like transient and ethereal vibe to it, of course, which is, of course, very typical of me to say, given that it is an impressionist painting, and that is very common of the impressionist. That sort of fleeting feeling of light, of course, is what their goal was, and I think that Monet definitely achieved that here. So, as for like another purpose, like I said earlier, he was sort of exploring light, and in doing so, he utilized color and value for sure. Definitely why I mentioned color and value earlier. Uh, so I would say that the purpose of this was art for the purpose of, using formal properties. And that is my presentation. Thank you very much.